Rome did not fall in 410 AD because one enemy suddenly became too strong. Rome was sacked because the empire could no longer convert prestige into obedience, military coordination, or political trust. The true question is not how the Goths broke Rome's walls, but how Rome's rulers broke Rome's strategic coherence. By the early 5th century AD, the Western Roman Empire still possessed the language of universality, the habits of command, and the ceremonial splendor of an order that claimed the world. But beneath that grandeur lay a dangerous transformation. The empire was no longer a machine that could reliably turn tax into troops, troops into security, and security into loyalty. Therefore every crisis grew more expensive, every compromise more humiliating, and every ambitious commander more necessary. The sack of Rome was not a lightning strike from outside civilization. It was the visible verdict on a system that had been hollowing from within for decades. The larger chessboard had already shifted long before Alaric approached Italy. After the imperial world settled into a more durable division between Eastern and Western courts, the balance between the halves was unequal. The Eastern Empire possessed denser cities, stronger fiscal reserves, and a richer web of administrative continuity. But the Western Empire faced longer frontier problems, weaker tax extraction in vulnerable provinces, and a harsher dependence on improvised military solutions. That asymmetry did not guarantee immediate collapse. But it meant that every Western emergency consumed reserves that could not easily be replaced. The state still appeared colossal. Therefore many elites mistook inherited scale for present strength. Then came the transformation opened by the Gothic crossing of the Danube in 376 AD. This event was not merely a migration. It was a stress test of Roman assumptions. For centuries, the empire had relied on a familiar frontier logic: outside peoples could be admitted, fragmented, settled, recruited, taxed, supervised, and ultimately absorbed under Roman terms. But the handling of the Gothic entry was corrupt, violent, and strategically foolish. Hunger, mistreatment, and fear turned a population seeking survival into a military problem. The disaster at Adrianople in 378 AD did more than destroy an emperor and a field army. It shattered the old confidence that Rome could always process frontier pressures through superior organization. The empire remained formidable, but its monopoly on strategic initiative had been broken. That change reshaped the entire late Roman order. Roman law still functioned. Roads still tied provinces together. Taxation still fed armies and courts. Official titles still radiated legitimacy across the Mediterranean world. But the practical mechanics of Western survival increasingly depended on negotiated arrangements with powerful armed groups and on generals whose authority rested on personal networks as much as formal office. This was the late Roman paradox: the empire remained supreme in symbolism while becoming precarious in execution. A state can endure many external dangers. It begins to fail when ceremony masks the erosion of administrative and coercive capacity. Rome itself embodied that paradox more perfectly than any other city. By 410 AD, Rome was no longer the daily command center of imperial strategy. Ravenna, surrounded by marshes and easier to defend, had become the operational capital of the Western court. From there, an emperor could survive. But Rome remained something more important than an office seat. It was the theater of memory. It was the shrine of conquest, law, ancestry, and empire without horizon. To threaten Ravenna was to challenge a government. To threaten Rome was to challenge a civilization's mythology of itself. The city had ceased to direct power, but it still defined power's meaning. Meanwhile, the Western system groaned under deeper social and political strains. Aristocratic wealth remained enormous, especially in Italy, but wealth was not the same as state capacity. Provincial insecurity weakened confidence. Frontier pressures multiplied. Religious disputes sharpened old anxieties and gave crisis a cosmic vocabulary. Court politics became increasingly suffocated by suspicion, accusation, and factional maneuver. The empire still claimed universal dominion, but it was attempting to preserve that claim with narrowing means. Therefore every decision became more defensive, more personal, and more short-sighted. What was at stake in the years before 410 AD was not simply whether one city might be attacked. The greater question was whether the Western Empire could still bind elites, command armies, feed strategic centers, and keep armed outsiders inside a Roman political framework. Once that binding power weakened, force alone could no longer stabilize the system. Into this world stepped Alaric, one of the most misunderstood figures of late antiquity. Popular memory often casts him as a barbarian destroyer standing beyond Rome and against civilization. But that portrait conceals the true strategic logic of his career. Alaric was not trying to annihilate the Roman world in a fit of primitive rage. He was pursuing leverage inside a Romanized political universe. He sought pay, secure settlement, high command, official recognition, and a stable future for the armed following that depended on him. His method was coercive, but its grammar was Roman. He applied military pressure in order to force political acknowledgement. In that sense, Alaric represented not the opposite of Rome, but one of the empire's most dangerous byproducts. This is why the late Roman military system mattered so much. The empire had long relied on recruiting and incorporating non-Roman manpower. Such practices were not signs of weakness by themselves. Rome had often grown stronger by absorbing outsiders. But by the late 4th and early 5th centuries AD, incorporation was less stable, less generous, and less coherent. Armed groups could be used without being fully secured. Commanders could be employed without being fully trusted. Expectations could be raised without being durably satisfied. Therefore military partnership became militarized bargaining. Rome was creating forces it needed, while denying them the certainty that would keep them loyal. Against this unstable reality stood Stilicho, the Western Empire's indispensable general and, for a time, its principal strategist. His importance cannot be measured merely by rank. Stilicho understood the true mechanics of Western survival. He grasped that the empire no longer possessed the luxury of total solutions. It required triage. It required mobile defense rather than theatrical omnipotence. It required selective negotiation, containment, and incorporation. It required buying time in one theater to preserve capacity in another. Such methods were politically unattractive because they admitted limitation. But they were strategically realistic. Stilicho was not governing an empire at its height, he was managing a grand but strained system that could survive only through disciplined improvisation. That made him necessary. But in fragile political systems, necessity often breeds resentment. Emperor Honorius, ruling from Ravenna, inherited a throne whose ceremonial authority far exceeded his ability to command outcomes directly. His instinct leaned toward preservation through withdrawal. This was understandable on a personal level. Ravenna was safer. Distance reduced immediate danger. But what protected the emperor physically also widened the gap between imperial survival and imperial authority. The court increasingly confused the ruler's security with the state's security. Therefore problems that required political risk were deferred in the name of stability, even as the cost of delay kept rising. Around Honorius swirled court factions eager to convert uncertainty into advantage. In such environments, strategic nuance becomes vulnerable to moral panic. Stilicho's policies, because they involved negotiation with powerful armed outsiders and difficult trade-offs among theaters, could be portrayed as weakness or even treason. Ethnic suspicion sharpened these charges. Rivals weaponized fear of barbarian influence at court. The result was catastrophic. In 408 AD, Stilicho was executed by the very regime that depended on the kind of judgment only he had been consistently providing. This was not merely the death of a general. It was the deliberate destruction of Western strategic coherence. The disaster deepened immediately. After Stilicho's fall, anti-barbarian violence erupted against families and dependents connected to federate and foreign-born soldiers in Roman service. Thousands who might have remained within the imperial military orbit now had every reason to defect. They moved into Alaric's camp, carrying manpower, grievance, and proof that the Western court could not distinguish between necessary partners and existential enemies. Here, the empire committed one of history's classic self-inflicted strategic blunders. Paranoia eliminated the very competence and cooperation needed for survival. An insecure regime often believes ruthlessness proves strength. In reality, indiscriminate suspicion advertises weakness. Logistics now became politics in the most unforgiving way. Alaric did not need to conquer the whole empire. Such a project would have been unrealistic. He needed pressure points. Italy was one. Rome's food anxiety was another. Senatorial fear was another. The inability of Ravenna to synchronize military response with diplomatic settlement was perhaps the greatest of all. By maneuvering in Italy and threatening Rome, Alaric transformed geography into leverage. The city's population, prestige, and dependence on grain made it vulnerable not merely to assault but to psychological strangulation. Therefore each movement of his army created political effects far larger than its numbers alone would suggest. This is crucial to understand. The road to the sack was not a simple sequence of raids. It was coercive statecraft conducted by military means. Alaric besieged, negotiated, demanded ransom, exchanged hostages, and probed for recognition. The Senate, trapped between fear and necessity, sought survival under duress. Honorius sought safety and room for maneuver. Generals sought position. Regional officials sought to avoid destruction in their own jurisdictions. No actor controlled the entire board. This was the fog of war at the level of empire, rational short-term decisions colliding inside an irrational system. By 408 AD, with Stilicho gone and Western politics disoriented, Alaric entered Italy as both threat and negotiator. Rome was besieged. But the objective was not immediate extermination. The city functioned as a hostage made of memory. Through encirclement and deprivation, Alaric forced the Senate into negotiation. A massive ransom was extracted. Gold, silver, goods, and labor were surrendered. The event itself was humiliating. But humiliation was not yet destruction. A durable settlement still remained possible if the Western court could accept strategic reality. That reality was simple and painful. Alaric's following needed a recognized place within the imperial order, and the empire lacked the power to deny this indefinitely without cost. Yet the court in Ravenna resisted accommodation. This resistance should not be caricatured as pure stupidity. It emerged from genuine fears. To reward coercion seemed to invite more coercion. To elevate Alaric seemed to legitimize extortion. To concede under pressure appeared dishonorable and dangerous. But strategy is often the art of choosing the least destructive humiliation before events impose a greater one. Honorius and his circle confronted a narrowing set of options, but they repeatedly treated delay as if delay itself were a policy. Therefore each rejected compromise made the next settlement harsher and the next crisis less manageable. The strategic logic behind targeting Rome now intensified. Since Ravenna was difficult to storm and the emperor could hide behind defensible geography, direct assault on the operational capital offered uncertain reward. But Rome possessed a different kind of vulnerability. It was symbol without adequate protection. It was prestige without corresponding military centrality. Alaric recognized that by threatening Rome, the court's own mythology could be turned against it. The city's unmatched prestige made it a pressure point precisely because the Western regime could not easily sacrifice it rhetorically, even if it had already ceased to prioritize it operationally. Here lay the cruel paradox of late empire: what mattered most to legitimacy was no longer what the state could best defend. A further political experiment followed. Priscus Attalus, a Roman senator, was elevated as a rival emperor under Alaric's influence. This was not the behavior of a mere pillager seeking only loot. It was regime manipulation. Alaric was testing whether imperial legitimacy could be redirected rather than simply broken. If a compliant emperor could be installed, perhaps recognition, resources, and settlement might be obtained through political restructuring instead of endless siege. But this maneuver exposed another late Roman truth: seizing symbols of authority was easier than making them function. Attalus lacked the means to solve the grain question, especially with Africa's role unresolved, and he could not compel the strategic coordination necessary to transform claim into power. Therefore the experiment faltered. This failure mattered enormously. Grain was not simply food. In late Roman politics, grain was urban stability, elite confidence, and governmental credibility made tangible. Control of supplies from Africa was thus inseparable from the wider contest. Any regime that could not guarantee provisioning at Rome stood on weakened ground. Alaric understood leverage, but leverage alone could not create a stable order. Attalus could perform legitimacy but not deliver it. Therefore Alaric discarded him. Once again the possibility of settlement with Honorius returned to the foreground. At this stage, one of history's most painful patterns became visible. Repeated chances for stabilization had appeared. None had required perfect trust, only enough calculation to prefer an imperfect peace over escalating disorder. Yet every round of bargaining was poisoned by mistrust, factional interference, and competing ambitions. Negotiations with Honorius approached accommodation. But the process remained brittle because no side believed the other's restraint would endure. Then came renewed disruption, including the destabilizing intervention of Sarus. Whether measured as sabotage, rivalry, or reckless opportunism, the effect was the same: the fragile possibility of compromise shattered. The sack that followed was not the first option. It was the final verdict on failed bargaining. In August 410 AD, the endgame arrived. The Salarian Gate was opened, likely from within, and Alaric's forces entered Rome. For 3 days the city was plundered. The scale must be described with discipline. This was not the total annihilation of Rome, nor the immediate end of the Western Empire. Some churches were respected as sanctuaries. Some forms of restraint existed amid violence and seizure. But to focus too narrowly on limits would miss the strategic truth. The unthinkable had happened. The city that had ruled the Mediterranean imagination for centuries had been penetrated, exposed, and humiliated. Rome had learned, before the world, that it could bleed. The psychological impact far exceeded the military event. For generations, Roman power had rested partly on a habit of belief. The empire was not seen merely as strong. It was seen as the structure within which history itself was ordered. Even when provinces revolted or armies mutinied, the idea of Rome's central inviolability still exerted force. But after 410 AD, that mental fortress cracked. Elites across the empire and beyond it now knew that the sacred center could be endangered and that the emperor might survive elsewhere while Rome suffered. Prestige, once assumed, became negotiable. This was not only a military humiliation. It was a revelation about the limits of Roman protection. Yet the Western Empire did not vanish overnight. Officials continued to govern. Taxes were still extracted. Laws were still issued. Armies were still assembled. This fact matters, because collapse in history is rarely cinematic in the way memory prefers. Institutions can continue after their aura is broken. Administration can function after confidence has been deeply wounded. Therefore 410 AD must not be misread as a simple final ending. It was more subtle and, in some ways, more consequential. The empire survived materially, but under a new condition, it had to operate without the old illusion of unquestioned invincibility. Survival after symbolic disembowelment is not the same as recovery. The blow to legitimacy spread through multiple layers of society. Provincial elites watched the center fail to protect its most sacred city. Military commanders observed that force and negotiation were increasingly flowing through regional and personal channels rather than reliably from the imperial core. Outside peoples saw proof that Rome could be pressured and that imperial authority could be bargained with, circumvented, or tested. Such knowledge changes behavior. Once the perception of permanence weakens, every ambitious actor recalculates. Loyalty becomes conditional. Distance becomes opportunity. Delay becomes more tempting. The state still existed, but more and more participants began acting as though history had entered a different phase. The ideological shock was equally profound. For pagan critics, the sack seemed evidence that abandonment of ancestral gods had invited ruin. For Christian thinkers, the crisis demanded a more radical interpretation. Augustine, above all, responded by redefining the meaning of political order itself. The city of God would insist that no earthly empire, however magnificent, could claim eternity. This was not merely theology answering disaster. It was intellectual triage for a civilization discovering that its greatest political structure was mortal. When institutions can no longer guarantee meaning, philosophy and religion must absorb the shock. In retrospect, 410 AD foreshadowed the larger pattern of the 5th century. Authority became more fragmented. Regional actors grew stronger. Bargaining with armed groups became more central. Dependence on military strongmen intensified. The Western state increasingly reacted rather than directed. None of this emerged from the sack alone. The tendencies were already present. But the sack exposed them publicly and irreversibly. It converted structural weakness into visible fact. That conversion is one of the most decisive moments in the life of any civilization. Hidden weakness can be managed. Visible weakness reorganizes the calculations of everyone involved. The human lesson is severe. Elite systems under strain rarely fail gracefully. They turn inward. They personalize danger. They punish competence because competence is politically threatening. They cling to ceremonial superiority long after strategic conditions have changed. Such systems can still speak in the language of destiny while acting in the logic of panic. Stilicho's execution, the purge of useful military dependence, the inability to rank threats correctly, the refusal to secure a durable settlement when one remained possible, these were not random errors. They were expressions of a ruling structure that had lost the trust necessary for coherent action. Declining powers often do not suffer from too few options. They suffer from too little political confidence to choose among them wisely. This is why the sack of Rome remains more than an episode of ancient violence. It is a case study in imperial credibility. The Western Empire still possessed roads, offices, titles, taxation, and memory. But power is never made of machinery alone. It also rests on belief that commands will be obeyed, that allies will be protected, that elites will sacrifice for the center, that compromise will not be punished as betrayal, and that symbols correspond to real capacity. Once those beliefs erode, every challenge becomes larger than its material size. A frontier problem becomes a legitimacy crisis. A negotiation becomes an accusation. A siege becomes a civilizational wound. The verdict, then, is stark. The sack of 410 AD did not prove that Alaric was stronger than Rome in every measurable sense. It proved that Rome had become weaker than its image. The Western Empire's rulers failed to transform immense prestige into coordinated action. They protected the emperor but endangered the meaning of empire. They inherited a system still formidable enough to survive shocks, but too mistrustful to absorb them intelligently. Therefore the city that had conquered nations was finally made hostage by its own unraveling. The true cost was counted not only in plunder or captivity, but in the collapse of a shared illusion. For centuries, Rome had presented itself as the permanent architecture of order. After 410 AD, permanence itself became doubtful. That doubt was strategic. It changed negotiations, loyalties, ambitions, and fears across the Western world. A civilization can continue administratively after suffering a mortal psychological defeat. But once the belief in its inevitability dies, every remaining crisis cuts deeper. The modern mirror is impossible to ignore. Great institutions rarely collapse on the first day they become fragile. They collapse on the day their fragility becomes visible to all concerned. The warning of 410 AD is not simply that enemies gather at the gate. Enemies always gather at gates. The deeper warning is that systems decay when leadership mistakes image for capacity, safety for authority, and delay for strategy. States can become so devoted to managing appearances that they fail to preserve the trust, competence, and incorporation on which real durability depends. The palace often opens the gates long before the outsider enters. And so the legacy question remains, stubborn and unanswerable by any simple chronology, when a civilization still possesses its ceremonies, its wealth, its titles, and its memory, but no longer possesses the confidence to reward competence, bind useful outsiders, and face strategic reality without self-deception, has it already begun to fall, even before a single gate is opened. If this episode sharpened the way the fall of Rome is understood, subscribe for historically rigorous explorations of power, collapse, and strategy told at the civilizational scale. And on the end screen, continue directly to the next episode for the other half of this larger pattern of imperial crisis. Before that, answer one question in the comments: what destroyed Rome's credibility more decisively, the execution of Stilicho, the refusal to settle with Alaric, or the choice to protect the emperor while exposing the meaning of Rome itself?